Yeah, no, that's really cool that you got to do that. That's like, as a prosecutor, that seems like just an amazing job because obviously it seems like you like to like help others. So it seemed you got to do that and still helping others in a huge way, which
Yeah,
is really cool.
yeah, yeah. It was it was good. It's a very different way to do public service than direct service, like as a teacher, certainly as a state rep, but it's great in its own way.
Yeah, for sure. When you were in high school, was there any specific area that you were passionate about and it was important enough to you that eventually, all these years later, not too many years, but few, that you brought it into policy?
You're really making me think about what high school was like. I think I cared about environmental issues in high school. I don't think I really understood what that meant, but I could recognize that it was important. And certainly that's something that I've been working on as a state representative. It's something that I've run on. Possibly my most important legislative accomplishment of my first term involved Massport and revising Massport's charter through legislation for the first time since 1956 to require Massport to consider environmental impacts and environmental justice principles in its decision making. And Massport makes a lot of very consequential decisions on developments in Massachusetts. So that has definitely carried over.
I could be wrong here, but I think Massport is the one in charge of Hanscom Airfield, right?
Yes.
And you live in Concord.
Yes.
There's obviously all that going on with Hanscom. It's been
Yes.
going on for a while. Do you have an opinion on it?
Well, I think the proposal is not reasonable. It just is not reasonable. The impacts are going to be way too profound from both an emission standpoint and in other ways too. We have Minuteman National Historic Park here. If we care about places like that, if we think it really is important to preserve an area like that and make it accessible to people, make it such that if you have a tour guide and are learning about the revolutionary history of that space, which I personally think is very important, that you can actually hear your tour guide um, without planes constantly flying not so high overhead, then that's something that we need to protect. So sometimes you have to make hard choices, and maybe it's a hard choice, maybe it's not so hard a choice between having, a tripling of private jets in the Hanscom area versus some of the other drawbacks of doing that. But I think it's not a good thing for our district if that project, as it's currently proposed, is able to go through.
For sure, I understand that for sure. So I know you haven't been in politics for long. I think you started in 2022, so 2 years now.
Yes,
Hopefully, a long time more.
hope so.
But how has it changed already in that short time, and how do you think it will continue to change in the future?
On the state level, I haven't observed a lot of changes, or at least I don't think that I have the historical perspective to say that much has changed. I've been paying attention, just like all members of the general public, to national politics. I think that's probably changed a lot more. We saw and to me, the election results in November really speak to a general sentiment that I don't think at least the Democratic Party was ready to reckon with until the results came out. It just had to be shown. Joe Biden didn't drop out of the race until the polls showed that he just couldn't win, right? And I don't think the Democratic Party was ready or willing to change, and it's to be determined whether there is any going to be any change there until it got completely shellacked in the Electoral College and lost the national popular vote. And we saw here in Massachusetts, on the state level, um, there was not a good performance by either Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate or straight down the ticket. And so I think we have to really reckon with what that means. I think those conversations are ongoing. My hope is that there's a lot of internal reflection before folks on my side of the aisle just turn straight to like, how are we going to beat the other guy?
I can understand that, yeah. I mean, especially in this area where there's a lot of Democrats, and it's just like, I feel like I don't know enough about it exactly because I just have never really dug deep enough into people's opinions because, of course, it's a touchy subject. That, like, change isn't really the mind, it's just the keep going or persuade others to join along, is all I've really heard from people when discussing, like, the state's politics. Like, is there any view on that? Like, I don't really have, like, a question, but just off of that.
One of the cool things about being a state rep is that you do a lot of constituent services. And so there's a lot of like face to face interactions. I think more so than with other offices. And so you kind of have to talk to everybody. I think I'm not talking about any particular person, but I think at other levels of higher office, you can really inoculate yourself from having to talk to people who are not party activists. If you're a U.S. senator, you can go around about your day like only talking to the people who are in the ideological lane that you want to be in. You cannot do that as a state rep. It's just impossible. Um, I thought that the election result was for a long time until like right towards the end, especially in the spring. I thought like there's no way that Trump wasn't going to win, and that was just from talking to people out in the community. Um, so I think that that's more important, and I think that people at all levels of government need to go back to that a little bit because what I see is a really significant disconnect and a willingness to be disconnected that ought to have accountability at the ballot box.
In my last episode with Governor Sununu, he was saying the same thing where he does a lot to be able to stay in contact with his community so he doesn't like fall out of the loop. Yeah. So I think it shows like, and like you and him both have obviously high approval, like, and everyone like would support you guys as elected officials. And I think just from what I'm seeing, a lot of that's attributed to like putting in the work, to going and seeing like what people actually want that live in the areas.
And you have to like doing that too,
yeah.
Right? If you don't like doing it, then your constituents are going to know that you don't want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it is one of my favorite things to do to like go to the food pantry or go to the senior center. I just like doing that. I probably wouldn't have the opportunity to do that as much in other positions. So I think people can tell when you like the job. I have two reasons why I tell people that I really like the job. And I constantly and relentlessly remind my constituents of that. Number one is that I want them to know how thankful I am that they've supported me and let me continue to have it. And the other is that I want people to know that if anybody tries to run against me, I'm going to work really hard to beat them.
Well, lucky you didn't have that last time. We were just talking about that.
Yeah.
Next time, hopefully not again. But you are on a ton of committees and commissions like we were talking about earlier as well. You are also one of the chairs on the Anti-Semitism Commission. I know you're Jewish yourself. Is there any reason other than that you wanted to be on a position in that committee?
I was incredibly grateful that the House Speaker appointed me to that position. And, when you come into a job like this, Gerald, you don't necessarily know what opportunities are going to come up. But I kind of feel like once that opportunity presented itself, that was the answer of why I was doing this in the first place. By this, I mean becoming a state representative, or at least a really big reason why. We've had a very alarming rise in anti-Semitism, and I'm just taking October 7th out of the equation, happening before that. All across the country, and Massachusetts' rise was outpacing that of other states based on the best data we have in schools, out in the community, in terms of hate crimes. So that's been very alarming. And of course, after October 7th, what we saw was totally unacceptable. And it really kind of peeled back the curtain on how people and institutions look at Jews. So that idea for the commission was not mine. It was actually an idea from my now good friend and colleague, a state senator, John Vilas from Westfield, which is close to Springfield, and he is not Jewish. And he's co-chairing the commission with me. And I just mentioned that because you noted that I'm Jewish, and of course, my Judaism is an important part of why I think it's necessary to do this work. But I think allyship is really important as well. And so I'm so grateful that Senator Vilas decided to take the initiative to do this. We wouldn't have this commission without him, but also he's been an awesome partner in the work so far.
The commission's not that old. Maybe what, like a few months?
Yes,
A
we
year?
only had 2 meetings so far. Our third will be in January.
So, and were talking to me earlier. You've been in meetings all day so far. What's the commission hoping to accomplish right now? Like, what's being worked on and stuff like that?
The commission has a statutory charge to hit a number of different subject matter areas where anti-Semitism is relevant. We're looking right now at K through 12 education. We're going to look at some community best practices. The Anti-Defamation League actually, on that note, just came out with a report where they did something kind of interesting. They sent out job applications with the exact same credentials with Jewish names and non-Jewish names. And unfortunately, they received very robust data showing that simply the name of the person, if it is Jewish, relates in less offers for an interview to a sadly statistically significant extent. So we'll probably take a look at that. We'll dive into higher education, which is going to be pretty spicy, I think. And we will look at Massachusetts hate crime laws and how law enforcement has been responding, training, and doing everything relevant to anti-Semitism and acts of hate and bias. And then at the end of all that, we'll be making some recommendations. We may file some legislation. We may make recommendations as to the state's fiscal year budget to support programming that we think that will be successful in combating anti-Semitism. And we hope that this is a model for other states to follow. This state commission is the first of its kind in the nation. And it's built in part, and this is embedded into the statute, on the White House's national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. So we think this is it's a really good start, but it's going to be hard work between now and November 30th of 2025 when the commission has its end date.
That's a lot to pack down, but I agree. I think it is really important. I think just with all that's going on in the world, personally, I'm going to throw my own belief in here. I thought I wouldn't do this in the show, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think people are summing up. People have this, want to make things really simplistic that aren't really simplistic. I'm not saying you, just in general people, about things that are so much like details and things that maybe there is no wrong or right, and they try to find that when it's very difficult to do that. Is there any, when you talk to people like that, do you think there's any way you found to maybe not persuade them into something, but just try to help them figure it out?
So at this point, I have not spent a ton of my emotional energy trying to convince people who do or say ridiculous things that they're wrong. And the reason for that is strategic. Part of it is a little bit self-protectionist, but also because I think for now, my time is better spent kind of rallying the troops of the reasonable people and trying to get consensus. And if that ends up, hopefully that will be as inclusive as possible. But we're not going to be able to convince everyone. And frankly, that is not my goal. People who take videos of themselves tearing down posters about the hostages, it is not my job to fix you. And if I tried to, first of all, I think I'd fail. And second of all, that would be all I could do, basically. So what I'm trying to do is model how we can approach this and also amplify the voices of those who are doing really good work. And often, what we see is that the best practices come from people who approach this very humbly and with an open mind. An example was recently we actually had the superintendent of Acton Boxborough Public Schools come and testify before the commission at our last meeting. And I invited him for a few reasons. One is that when he became superintendent and for a time after that, the DEI training program at the school did not have anything expressly about anti Semitism or Jewishness, even though there had been acts of anti Semitism, explicit acts of anti Semitism happening on campus. And Jewish families were feeling that in terms of the response. He recognized that that was a problem. He convened a group that included the rabbi in the local synagogue. They started to rewrite and fix those policies. He did a listening session at the synagogue. And they now have, I think, a statewide model about how to address these issues. That's, that's the kind of thing we want to see and amplify on the commission.
Going back to you teaching, special education is an area that a lot of people need, and it's, I think personally, as someone who's been with ADHD, who's been through special education for a long time now, I think I can acknowledge maybe at times it's hard to go through it. I mean, you want to be in all those classes, which now I am, but at one point it was a little tough to be in it, and you don't want to be in classes obviously that you don't want to be in, because a lot of times special education isn't the most fun thing, because you're sitting there going over basic things and stuff like that.
And one thing on that, people with ADHD like me, it's actually chemically more difficult for us to do things we don't want to do. It's not just like we're complaining. It's not an excuse either. In the real world, like nobody's feeling bad for us, but it is true that it is scientifically, chemically, like the physics of how our brain works. It's harder for us to do things that we don't want to do than it is for people without ADHD, all other things being equal, to do things they don't want to do.
Yeah. Sorry,
Just remember, if you have a kid with ADHD or a spouse.
I think that is important to remember for sure. For sure, I was just thinking the same thing. So you said you were having trouble as a special education teacher.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about, my mind got sidetracked for a second. As a special education teacher, you made it sound like it maybe was like thrown upon you a little bit.
Yeah. That's right.
I'm making it like a little less than you did, but because it seems tough, because thinking not only were you going to go into a different subject entirely, but you were thinking not special education. So how did you had a hard time adjusting? How does that how do you convert just entirely from doing that?
So lacrosse did help a lot. It really did help a lot, because the kids started to see me as something else, and they started to respect me, and they also understood that I now had this thing that they really liked that I could take away. And it wasn't all of the students in my class that were playing lacrosse, but it was the most challenging students. And so when they came into class the next day and all the other kids saw, oh, they're listening to Cataldo and they're actually did their homework and they're like sitting up straight and they're looking at him and they're not being disrespectful, like, oh, I better do what he's doing. So that helped a ton. It also helped that I didn't quit because for the first, like, the average tenure for teachers in that area, like with that demographic in special education at that age group, is like 6 months. So they knew that there was a really high probability that I wouldn't come back after Christmas. So when I did come back after Christmas, and then I did come back after February break, I think they were like, oh, he might be around, so I might as well like settle in here and get used to this. And I mentioned the test scores, but I swear, like my kids learned almost nothing from September to December, almost nothing. But then they caught up. So there was so much learning that happened once they started to kind of get locked in. It was like a springboard effect.
I think maybe, I don't know how to say this, but people tend to overestimate someone's will to learn something that they're not being influenced to want to learn. Because I feel like you can always throw something at someone, like a kid, and they'll figure it out eventually.
Yeah.
But if they don't want to learn it, it's just so tough. And I feel like that's just something that's like should be acknowledged more. I feel like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, there are certain things that you have to be able to do, right? We just kind of had this conversation on the statewide level as it deals with the MCAS. Like, if you cannot do some basic things, you shouldn't have a high school diploma. You just shouldn't. But so we have to make sure that kids are learning to read and write, for sure. That's what I was doing, right? That's what I was teaching. I was teaching basic geometry, basic algebra, and the kids needed to know that. Yeah, I was trying to do it in a way that was most accessible to them. I think that when I was starting out as a teacher, I was way more obsessed with the lesson plans and the niceties of the lesson plans and the details of the lesson plans than I should have been. And what I didn't quite understand is that if the kids didn't respect me and I couldn't manage my classroom, it almost didn't matter. So I would, stay up late on a Sunday night planning this lesson for a Monday for a 45-minute class, and we would get through like 5 minutes of the material before everything completely dissolved into chaos. And so it didn't really matter. Once I figured out a way to um, gain some respect with my students, then they were able to completely learn the material, despite some very significant learning challenges and emotional challenges.
You're doing a lot of stuff on the state level. I've mentioned a few times now, but is there anything specifically you're doing educationally for special education as well?
So I don't have any specific legislation. One of the major issues that we're experiencing now has to do with funding for special education in Massachusetts and the cost of what's called out of district placements, which are sky high. And it's causing a lot of strife fiscally with our communities. We're seeing this all over the state. We have a kind of complicated system where we have something called Prop 2.5, which is a limit of how high localities can raise taxes. And for better or worse, that number recently has been way under the rate of inflation. So we have these rising costs. We have a cap on what localities can do with taxes, and we have a limited amount of support coming back from the state, and that's causing a lot of issues. And one of the main issues with that is special education funding, uh, and, and it causes like these tragic situations where a school district has a really hard time doing what it needs to do to support a kid academically, but then it's really hard for the community to afford to send a kid to another school that can meet those needs, especially because the costs are sky high. So that's something that we need to fix, and we need to fix it on a systemic level in Massachusetts. And it's something that there's a couple of bills out there that are looking at that now.
And as we're wrapping up here, I was just wondering if do you have any aspirations to run for a higher office like governor or senator?
I really like the job that I have now. And I've found that even though there are 160 members of the House, if you have good relationships, if you make the time um, to really understand your colleagues in the legislature and have them understand you, and make those friendly relationships, there's a lot that you can get done. The state legislature in Massachusetts is very powerful relative to other states. We have a high degree of authority. We also, because of the party political dynamics, we have we can override any veto, no matter who the governor is. So there's a lot that can be done in the state legislature, and I found that there's a lot that I've been able to do for our community. So I'm happy doing that, and I'm gonna just ride this out.
Before we finish, is there anything you'd want to say to maybe the next generation, some advice or anything like that?
I would say work really hard. I have 3 little kids. I want to raise kids who work hard, are respectful, respect their elders, respect their teachers, go into situations abiding by the truism that you're born with 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And, look for opportunities that are going to be really rigorous. I talk to a lot of people your age and a little bit older who are looking for internships and thinking of their first job. The advice that I always give them is to do something hard, rigorous, challenging, and in person. Set aside the Zoom internship, the remote internship. Remote work may sound convenient to you. It's not going to pay off. Do something in person. Do something where you're going into a working environment where you have to have in-person interactions. That's how you're going to learn how to be a professional. Apply to my office. We have a really rigorous internship program, which is in person in the State House. And I know that my interns get way more from their interactions, their observations, their experiences when they're working in the State House or with me in the district than they do on the days that they're doing remote work. I would just say, if it's not challenging you, then it's probably not worth your time.
Well, I want to thank you, Representative Cataldo, for coming and taking the time to be here and giving your insight on how to make a better tomorrow. I also want to thank Minuteman Media and WIQH for allowing me to make this show, and thank you all for tuning in together and seeing, and as we all get this insight into our future, as we are the people's tomorrow. Thank you, and have a good night.